The sun was starting to set on what seemed like just another regular day in South Chicago. The streets were filled with the usual after-school buzz, kids walking home with their colorful backpacks, parents picking up their little ones, and teenagers hanging out near the local convenience store. Among them was a 16-year-old boy who everyone in the neighborhood knew for his bright smile and helping hands. This young man wasn't your typical teenager. Sure, he loved basketball and video games like any other kid his age, but there was something special about him. You'd often spot him helping Mrs. Wilson with her heavy grocery bags or staying back after school to help the janitor clean up the basketball court. That's just who he was, someone who cared about others without expecting anything in return. On this particular autumn afternoon, he was walking home from basketball practice, his gym bag slung over his shoulder. The air was crisp and fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he walked. He could hear the cheerful squeals and laughter of elementary school kids in the distance, reminding him of when he used to be that young and carefree. The local shops were closing up for the day, with the smell of fresh bread still lingering from the bakery. Mr. Lee, the owner of the corner store, waved at him as he passed by. "Hey kid, great game last night," he called out. The boy smiled and waved back, remembering the winning shot he'd made in yesterday's school game. As he walked, he thought about his mom working her second shift at the hospital. She always taught him to be kind and look out for others, just like she did with her patients. Her words echoed in his mind. "Baby, in this world, we all need to take care of each other. That's what makes us human." He was planning to surprise her by cooking dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just some mac and cheese with her favorite cornbread recipe that Grandma had taught him. His mom worked so hard, she deserved to come home to a warm meal and a clean house. The sound of children playing grew louder as he approached the busy intersection near the elementary school. It was always hectic at this time, with parents rushing to pick up their kids and people heading home from work. He watched as a group of small children waited patiently at the crosswalk, their teachers making sure everyone stayed in line. The crossing guard, an elderly man who'd been working that same corner for over 20 years, gave him a friendly nod. They had their own little ritual. Every day, they'd exchange knowing looks about the crazy traffic and wild kids. Today was no different, except maybe the traffic was a bit heavier than usual. He'd adjusted his gym bag, feeling the satisfying ache in his muscles from practice. Coach had pushed them hard today, preparing for the upcoming championship game. But he didn't mind. Basketball was his passion, and the court was where he felt most alive. His teammates often joked that he had a sixth sense for the ball, always knowing where to be at the right time. Little did he know that this ordinary walk home was about to turn into something extraordinary. Sometimes life's biggest moments come when we least expect them, testing our courage and humanity in ways we never imagined. For this young man, the next few minutes would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in the community. As he approached the busiest part of the intersection, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Through the sea of cars and people, he spotted a tiny figure that would soon need his help more than anyone had ever needed it before. The events that were about to unfold would show everyone that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're just regular people who choose to do the right thing, even when it's dangerous. Time has a funny way of slowing down right before something big happens. That's exactly what happened at the corner of Oak and Main Street that autumn afternoon. The young boy stood there, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion movie playing right in front of his eyes. Through the crowd of people and cars, he noticed a little girl, probably around 7 years old, wearing a bright pink backpack that seemed almost too big for her tiny frame. She was walking slightly ahead of her mom, who was caught up in what seemed to be an important phone call. The girl had that carefree bounce in her step that only children have, completely unaware of the dangerous world around her. The air was filled with the usual city sounds, cars honking, people chatting, the whoosh of buses passing by. But somehow, above all that noise, he heard the distinct sound of something dropping. The little girl's backpack had slipped off her shoulder, spilling some of her drawings onto the street. Without thinking twice, she turned around and darted into the road to grab her precious artwork. At that exact moment, a large delivery truck came speeding around the corner. The driver was checking his GPS, trying to find the fastest route to his next destination. He hadn't noticed the tiny figure that had suddenly appeared in his path. The truck's engine roared as it picked up speed, completely unaware of the tragedy that was about to happen. The girl's mother was still on her phone, her back turned to the street. Other pedestrians were wrapped up in their own worlds, some looking at their phones, others rushing to get home after a long day. Nobody else seemed to notice what was about to happen. But our young hero saw everything, and in that split second, he knew he had to act. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Everything he'd learned on the basketball court about timing and quick reactions was about to be put to a very different kind of test. This wasn't about making a winning shot anymore, this was about saving a life. The distance between the truck and the little girl was getting smaller by the second. He could see her small hands reaching for her scattered papers, still completely oblivious to the danger heading straight for her. The sun reflected off the truck's windshield, momentarily blinding the driver, who was just now beginning to realize something was wrong. People on the sidewalk started to notice too. He could hear gasps and shouts of warning beginning to rise from the crowd. A woman screamed. Someone dropped their coffee cup. But warnings and screams wouldn't be enough. There wasn't time for the little girl to process what was happening and move out of the way. The boy's mind raced through all his options in a fraction of a second. Should he yell? Should he try to alert the truck driver? No. The only thing that could save her now was direct action. His muscles tensed as he prepared to do something that would either save a life or put his own at serious risk, maybe both. Time seemed to stand still as he made his decision. His mom's words from that morning echoed in his head. Always do what's right, even when it's scary. Well, this was definitely scary, but it was also definitely right. Without hesitation, he dropped his gym bag and sprinted toward the street. The truck's brakes began to squeal as the driver finally saw what was happening. But physics doesn't care about good intentions. A vehicle that size, moving at that speed, needs time to stop. Time they didn't have. The boy could feel his heart in his throat as he ran faster than he'd ever run before. In those few seconds, he wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about the risk or the danger. All he could think about was that little girl and how she reminded him of his younger sister. All he could focus on was getting to her before the truck did. The gap between life and death was closing fast, and he was the only one who could change how this story would end. People would later say they'd never seen anyone move so fast. But for the boy, time had slowed to a crawl. He could see everything with crystal clarity. The fear beginning to dawn on the little girl's face as she finally heard the truck, the horror in the driver's eyes as he realized he couldn't stop in time, and the exact path he needed to take to reach her before it was too late. As he ran, he could feel the rough concrete under his feet, hear the screech of the truck's brakes, and sense the collective held breath of everyone watching. What happened next would be talked about in their community for years to come, a moment where ordinary life transformed into something extraordinary, where a split-second decision would test the very limits of human courage and compassion. They say when you're in real danger, your mind becomes incredibly clear. That's exactly what happened to the young boy in that heart-stopping moment. As he sprinted toward the little girl, everything around him seemed to move in slow motion, yet his thoughts were racing at lightning speed. He could hear his sneakers pounding against the pavement, each step bringing him closer to her. The sound of his own heartbeat, mixed with the truck's screeching brakes, created a terrifying symphony. The little girl had finally looked up, her eyes growing wide with fear as she realized the danger she was in. But she was frozen in place, clutching her drawings to her chest, unable to move. The boy's mind flashed back to all those basketball practices where coach had drilled them on quick thinking and fast reactions. It's not just about speed, coach would say, it's about making the right decision under pressure. Well, this was pressure like he'd never felt before. The truck was now just seconds away, its massive front grille bearing down on them like an angry giant. He did some quick math in his head, something he never thought he'd use outside of school. The truck was too close to stop completely. The girl was too scared to move. He had maybe 2 seconds to reach her and get them both out of the way. His eyes darted around, looking for the safest escape route. The concrete sidewalk was hard, but it was better than being hit by several tons of moving metal. People were shouting all around them now. He could hear someone yelling, "Watch out!" and another person screaming for help. But all those voices seemed distant, like they were coming from underwater. His entire world had narrowed down to one simple goal: reach the girl and get her to safety. His muscles were burning from the sprint, but he pushed harder. All those years of playing sports, all those extra laps around the track, all those early morning workouts, they were all leading up to this moment. His body knew exactly what to do, even if his mind was racing with fear and adrenaline. The truck driver was honking now, the loud blare adding to the chaos. The man's face was visible through the windshield, twisted with panic as he stood on the brakes. The wheels were locked, leaving dark skid marks on the road, but the huge vehicle was still sliding forward with unstoppable momentum. As the boy got closer to the girl, he could see the tears in her eyes, the way her small hands trembled as they clutched her precious drawings. He could smell the burning rubber from the truck's tires and feel the vibration of the massive vehicle through the ground. Everything was happening so fast, yet each detail was crystal clear in his mind. Just before he reached her, time seemed to pause for a split second. He could see individual leaves swirling in the wind, hear the collective gasp of the crowd, feel the rush of air as the truck bore down on them. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about being a hero or doing something brave. He was just thinking about his mom and how she always taught him to help others in need. He had to get this right. There would be no second chances. The angle had to be perfect, too much force, and he could hurt her, too little, and they wouldn't clear the truck's path. His mind calculated trajectories like a supercomputer, all while his body moved on pure instinct. The girl's mother had finally turned around, her phone dropping from her hand as she saw what was happening. The look of absolute terror on her face would stay with the boy forever. But he couldn't focus on that now. He had to concentrate on the next few seconds that would determine whether this story would end in tragedy or triumph. As he made his final approach, everything he'd ever learned about protecting himself in sports came flooding back. How to fall safely, how to shield others, how to roll with impact. He'd need all of those skills now. The truck was mere feet away, its shadow already falling over them like a dark cloud. The moment of truth had arrived. In less than a second, he would either save this little girl's life, or they would both be in serious danger. The entire intersection seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Nobody had ever seen anything like this in their quiet neighborhood. A young man running straight toward danger to save a complete stranger. This was the moment when everyday life transformed into something extraordinary, when a split-second decision would test not just physical courage, but the very essence of human compassion. As the boy made his final stride toward the girl, he wasn't just moving to save her. He was about to show everyone watching what true bravery looks like. What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. In one smooth motion, the boy reached the little girl and wrapped his arms around her tiny frame. Her drawings scattered in the wind like confetti, but that didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was getting her to safety. He didn't have time to explain or be gentle. With the truck just feet away, he pulled her close to his chest and launched them both toward the sidewalk. The boy twisted his body midair, making sure he would take the brunt of the impact. It was just like those diving saves he'd made on the basketball court, except this time, the stakes were life and death. The truck's side mirror clipped his shoulder as they rolled. He felt a sharp pain tear through his arm, but he didn't let go of the girl. They tumbled together, the boy's body acting as a shield, protecting her from the rough concrete. The world spun around them in a blur of colors and sounds, screaming tires, gasping onlookers, and the thunderous rumble of the truck passing by. When they finally came to a stop, the boy's shoulder was screaming in pain. But his first thought wasn't about himself. "Are you okay?" he asked the little girl who was clutching his shirt with trembling hands. She looked up at him with wide eyes, too shocked to cry, and managed a small nod. The intersection erupted in chaos. People were running toward them from every direction. The truck had finally screeched to a halt about 50 feet down the road. Its driver jumped out, his face pale as paper, hands shaking as he rushed back to check on them. The girl's mother reached them first, falling to her knees beside them. Tears were streaming down her face as she pulled her daughter into her arms. My baby," she kept saying over and over, holding her child close. Then she looked at the boy, her eyes filled with a gratitude that words could never express. Someone in the crowd was calling 911. Others were taking videos on their phones, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. An older woman pushed through the crowd with a first aid kit from her car. "That shoulder needs looking at," she said, noticing how the boy winced when he tried to move. But the boy was surprisingly calm. Despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder and the scrapes on his arms and legs, he managed to smile at the little girl. "Your drawings," he said, noticing her worried look at the papers scattered across the street. "We'll get you new paper and you can make even better ones." The crowd around them was growing larger. Mr. Lee from the corner store came running with bottled water. The crossing guard, who had seen everything, was already directing traffic away from the scene. Somewhere in the distance, sirens were wailing, getting closer by the second. "You're a hero," someone in the crowd said. The boy shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do," he replied, though everyone knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. Not everyone would have had the courage to run toward danger instead of away from it. The truck driver had reached them by now, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I didn't see her until it was almost too late. If it wasn't for this young man—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew what would have happened if the boy hadn't acted when he did. The pain in his shoulder was getting worse, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off. But the boy stayed focused on keeping the little girl calm. He asked her about her drawings, what she liked to draw, her favorite colors, anything to keep her mind off what had just happened. Her mother held both her daughter's hand and the boy's uninjured hand, unable to let go of either of them. As the ambulance pulled up, its lights painting the gathering crowd in flashes of red and white, people were already on their phones, calling friends and family to tell them what they'd seen. A story of extraordinary courage, of a young man who didn't hesitate to put himself in harm's way to save a child he didn't even know. The paramedics worked quickly, checking both the boy and the girl for injuries. The girl was physically fine, though shaken. The boy's shoulder was another story. The impact with the truck's mirror had left a deep gash, and there might be more damage underneath. But he hadn't once complained about the pain, hadn't once thought about himself first. This was more than just a rescue. It was a moment that would bring the whole community together, a reminder that heroes don't wear capes or have superpowers. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when it matters most. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity at the local hospital. The emergency room buzzed with energy as nurses and doctors moved quickly between rooms. The boy sat on an examination table, his torn basketball jersey replaced with a hospital gown, while doctors checked his injured shoulder. His mom had arrived within minutes of getting the call, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her shift at another hospital across town. When she burst into the room, her eyes were filled with tears, but her face showed pride mixed with worry. "Baby, what were you thinking?" she whispered, pulling him into a gentle hug, careful to avoid his injured shoulder. "I was thinking about what you always tell me," he answered with a small smile. "About helping others when they need it." His mom wiped her eyes, shaking her head but smiling. That's when the little girl's mother appeared in the doorway, her daughter holding tightly to her hand. The woman's eyes were red from crying, but she had a look of determination on her face. She walked straight up to the boy's mother and took her hands. "Your son," she started, her voice trembling, "your son saved my daughter's life." "I can never—" She couldn't finish the sentence as fresh tears began to fall. The little girl let go of her mother's hand and walked slowly to the boy's bedside. From behind her back, she pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper, a new drawing she'd made in the waiting room. On it was a simple but touching picture, 2 stick figures, one bigger than the other, with the words "My Hero" written in wobbly child's handwriting. Outside in the waiting room, local news reporters had already gathered. The story was spreading fast through social media, with videos of the rescue going viral. But inside the hospital room, none of that mattered. What mattered was this simple moment of connection between 2 families brought together by an extraordinary act of courage. The doctor returned with X-ray results. The boy had a deep gash that needed stitches, and his shoulder was badly bruised, but surprisingly, nothing was broken. "You were very lucky," the doctor said, "and very brave." He looked at the little girl and added with a smile, "Both of you were brave." While the doctor worked on stitching up the boy's shoulder, more visitors arrived. The basketball coach came straight from practice when he heard what happened. He stood in the doorway, usually loud voice unusually quiet, as he watched his player being treated. "That was some move you pulled out there," he finally said. "Better than any play I've ever taught you." The truck driver came too, having given his statement to the police. He couldn't stop apologizing, his hands still shaking slightly as he explained how he'd been distracted for just a moment. The boy assured him it was okay, that what mattered was that everyone was safe. The man broke down in tears, amazed at the forgiveness and maturity of someone so young. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. The waiting room filled with familiar faces. Mr. Lee from the corner store brought snacks, the crossing guard came after his shift, and several of the boys' teammates arrived wearing their basketball jerseys in support. Even some of the elementary school teachers came to check on the little girl. The hospital staff was amazed at how the boy handled all the attention. He kept insisting he wasn't a hero, that he just did what needed to be done. When asked if he was scared, he thought for a moment before answering honestly, "Yeah, I was scared." But being scared doesn't mean you can't also be brave. As evening fell, more people from the community gathered outside the hospital. Some brought food, others brought cards and well wishes. A group of local children made a huge thank you banner and hung it in the parking lot. The hospital had never seen anything quite like it, an entire neighborhood coming together to support one of their own. The little girl and her mother stayed until visiting hours were over. Before they left, the mother pressed something into the boy's hand. A card with their contact information. "We're family now," she said simply, her voice full of emotion. "What you did today, there are no words." As night settled in and the crowds finally began to thin, the boy lay back in his hospital bed, his mom sitting beside him. Through the window, they could see the city lights twinkling in the distance. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was just the beginning. What happened that day would have an impact far beyond their neighborhood, touching lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The story of what happened at that busy intersection spread like wildfire through the city. By the next morning, local news vans were parked outside the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. But what happened next surprised everyone, even the most experienced reporters. People from all walks of life began sharing the video of the rescue online. It wasn't just the dramatic save that caught people's attention, it was the way the young hero had acted afterward. His humility, his genuine concern for others, and his simple explanation that he was just doing what was right. The local news did their first interview right there in the hospital room. The boy sat up in his bed, his injured shoulder carefully bandaged, speaking softly but clearly. "I didn't think about being brave," he told the reporter. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I knew I could help them. That's all there was to it." His words touched something deep in people's hearts. In a world that often seemed divided, here was a story that brought people together. The comment sections under the news articles weren't filled with arguments. Instead, they were full of people sharing their own stories of everyday heroes, of times when strangers had helped them. The little girl's family started an online fundraiser to help with the boy's medical bills and college fund. They set a modest goal, thinking they might get a few $100s from neighbors and friends. Within 24 hours, the donations had surpassed $50,000. People from across the country were giving what they could, many leaving messages about how the story had given them hope. Back in the neighborhood, something beautiful was happening. The local elementary school where the little girl attended started a Everyday Heroes program, teaching kids about courage, kindness, and looking out for each other. They invited the boy to speak to the students once he recovered, wanting them to learn from his example. The high school basketball team dedicated their next game to their teammate. They all wore special armbands with a simple message, "Be someone's hero." The stands were packed that night, not just with students and parents, but with people from all over the city who had heard the story and wanted to show their support. Local businesses joined in too. The corner store where Mr. Lee worked put up a huge poster in their window celebrating their neighborhood hero. The coffee shop started a Pay It Forward campaign, encouraging customers to buy coffee for strangers. The local bakery created special cookies decorated with superhero capes, donating part of the proceeds to children's safety programs. But it wasn't just the local community that was touched by the story. National news networks picked it up, sending reporters to interview the boy, his family, and the little girl he saved. They were particularly moved by how the two families had bonded, showing up together for interviews, supporting each other through all the attention. Social media couldn't get enough of the story. People shared artwork they'd created inspired by the rescue. Musicians wrote songs about it. Teachers used it as an example in their classrooms. The hashtag Be an Everyday Hero started trending, with people sharing stories of small acts of kindness they'd witnessed or performed. The mayor announced plans to improve safety at the intersection where the incident happened. New traffic lights were installed, along with better crosswalk signals and signs. But more importantly, the city started a youth leadership program inspired by the Young Heroes example, focusing on community service and civic responsibility. The truck driver, still shaken by how close tragedy had come, became an advocate for road safety. He started visiting schools to talk about the importance of staying alert while driving and watching out for pedestrians. His honest speeches about almost being part of a tragedy touched many hearts and probably saved lives. Professional athletes heard about the story and sent signed jerseys and encouragement to the young hero. But what really touched him was a letter from a kid in another state who wrote, "I was scared to stand up to bullies at my school. But after hearing your story, I helped a younger kid who was being picked on. You taught me that being brave means doing what's right, even when you're scared." As the weeks passed, the media attention began to fade, but the impact of what happened that day didn't diminish. The boy returned to school, his shoulder healing well, to find that things had changed. His classmates didn't treat him like some unreachable hero. Instead, they were inspired to be better people themselves. The little girl started taking art classes, drawing picture after picture of everyday heroes she saw around her: the crossing guard helping kids across the street, firefighters saving cats from trees, older students helping younger ones with homework. Her art teacher was amazed at how she captured the simple beauty of people helping people. 1 year after that life-changing day at the intersection, the neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The young hero's story hadn't just faded away like most news stories do. Instead, it had planted seeds that grew into something beautiful and lasting. The boy, now a high school senior, still played basketball, but his life had taken on new meaning. Every Friday afternoon, you could find him at the community center he helped start, teaching younger kids about courage, kindness, and standing up for others. He didn't talk much about the rescue anymore. Instead, he focused on helping each child discover their own inner strength. "You don't have to save someone from a truck to be a hero," he would tell them. Sometimes being a hero means helping someone who dropped their books, or sitting with someone who's eating lunch alone, or standing up for someone who's being picked on. The kids would listen, wide-eyed, knowing that this wasn't just talk. He had lived these words. The little girl he saved had blossomed into a confident young artist. Her drawings, once scattered across that dangerous intersection, now hung proudly in the local library's children's section. She had started an art club at her school where kids drew pictures of everyday heroes in their lives. Parents working hard to provide for their families, teachers staying late to help struggling students, neighbors helping neighbors. The two families had grown incredibly close. They shared Sunday dinners, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other through life's ups and downs. The girl's mother had quit her high-stress corporate job to start a non-profit organization focusing on child safety and community building. "Life's too precious to waste on things that don't really matter," she often said. The intersection where it all happened had become a symbol of hope. The new safety measures had prevented countless accidents, but more importantly, it had become a gathering place for the community. Local artists had painted a beautiful mural on the corner building showing people helping people in all sorts of ways. Below it, in simple letters, were the words, "Courage is contagious." The boy's mom had been promoted at the hospital where she worked, partly because of how she handled all the attention with such grace. She started a mentorship program for young nurses, teaching them that healthcare wasn't just about medical procedures, it was about treating every patient with the same care you'd want for your own family. His basketball team had won the state championship that year, but that wasn't what made the coach most proud. It was how his players had started volunteering at local elementary schools, teaching kids about teamwork and looking out for each other. "Some victories don't come with trophies," the coach would say, "but they're the ones that matter most." The truck driver had become a regular speaker at schools and community events. He talked openly about how that day had changed his life, about the importance of staying focused while driving, and about the power of forgiveness. He and the boy had developed an unlikely friendship, often working together to promote road safety awareness. The story had sparked changes in other cities too. Communities across the country had started their own youth leadership programs, focusing on building courage, compassion, and community spirit. The hashtag Be an Everyday Hero had evolved into a national movement, with thousands of people sharing stories of small acts of kindness that made a big difference. Local businesses had created a scholarship fund for students who showed extraordinary kindness and courage in their daily lives. They named it after the intersection where the rescue happened, but the boy insisted that the first scholarship go to a quiet student who spent her free time helping elderly neighbors with their groceries and yard work. The crossing guard, who had witnessed it all, still worked at the same corner. But now he did more than just help kids cross the street. He knew each child by name, asked about their days, and reminded them that they all had the power to make a difference. "I saw a miracle happen right here," he would tell them. And miracles can happen anywhere, anytime, through any one of us. As the boy prepared for college, with acceptance letters from several universities thanks to both his grades and his community service, he reflected on how one moment had changed so many lives. His shoulder had healed, leaving only a small scar that he hardly noticed anymore. But the real change was inside, in his heart, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by what happened that day. The little girl had given him a new drawing on the anniversary of the rescue. It showed two people holding hands, one big, one small, with a bright sun shining above them. "This is us," she had said proudly. "But not just us, it's everybody who helps everybody else." The boy had smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. The story of the young hero who risked his life to save a little girl had become more than just a tale of one brave act. It had become a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, that true courage isn't about being fearless, but about doing what's right even when we're scared, and that sometimes the smallest actions can create the biggest changes.